You ever look at a really huge, complex problem, like unemployment or food security, and just think, why can't we just solve it? It feels like we have the smart people, we have the technology, but for some reason, the needle barely moves. Well, it turns out it's often because some challenges are just way too big for any one group to handle on their own.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How do you actually solve these massive problems when there's no single person in charge? How do you get everyone pulling in the same direction? Let's dig into what makes this kind of change so different from what we normally think about.
Most of us are familiar with organizational change, improving a single process or maybe restructuring a team. That's kind of like fixing one part of a machine. But what we're talking about today is on a whole different level. This is not about tuning up one part, it's about redesigning the entire factory from the ground up. A really great way to think about this is like an orchestra. You can have one absolutely brilliant violinist playing a beautiful solo, and that's great. But to create a true symphony, you need everyone. The strings, the brass, the percussion, all playing from the same sheet music, all guided by one conductor with a single vision. And that, right there, is the heart of a sector transformation. It's what has to happen when the goal is just too ambitious for any one player. It means getting different ministries, regulators, and even private companies to all change in sync. We're talking about a complete overhaul of how services get delivered, how data is shared, and ultimately, who is responsible for the final outcome. So how in the world do you even begin to map something that complex? Well, you need a blueprint, not just for one company, but for the entire ecosystem. And that blueprint has a name. It's called a sector value chain. And the key thing to understand here is the incredible scope. We're not just looking at one company's supply chain. A sector value chain maps out everything, from the very first step of sourcing raw materials all the way to a product's end of life. And it does this across hundreds of different organizations. It's the whole industry, from A to Z. At its core, it follows a pretty logical flow, right? Sourcing, production, distribution. But here's the magic. When you actually map this out for an entire sector, you suddenly see the whole picture with total clarity. You spot the hidden bottlenecks. You see where collaboration is breaking down. And this is the best part. You find where the biggest opportunities for change have been hiding in plain sight all along.
Now, these huge, difficult transformations don't just happen out of the blue. They're usually set off by specific breaking points, these moments when the old way of doing things just completely stops working. So what are these triggers?
A big one is when you have a goal that affects citizens directly, like creating jobs, but it falls between the cracks. The Ministry of Education, Labor, and Industry all have a piece of it, but no single one of them owns the final result. Another trigger is when you realize that to really modernize, everyone needs to get on board with a shared system, like a unified data platform. Or it's driven by those huge national visions that finally force different government silos to actually talk to each other and work as one.
Okay, so if this is so obviously necessary sometimes, why is it so incredibly rare and difficult? Well, it's because the very systems we depend on, they just weren't built for this kind of teamwork. The resistance is literally baked into the structure.
And here's the fundamental problem. Public organizations, especially ministries, are designed as vertical silos. Each one has its own legal mandate, its own separate budget, and its own unique set of goals and KPIs that define success.
The result is a system that's just full of barriers. You've got silos created by mandate, by funding, and by competing performance metrics. And unlike the private sector, there's no competitor breathing down your neck, threatening to put you out of business. That removes the natural, urgent pressure to innovate and adapt.
Think about it. In business, if you fail to collaborate and innovate, you go bankrupt. Simple as that. But in the public sector, that pressure just isn't there. And what this means is that transformation can't be some passive hope. It has to be an active, intentional, and really deliberate process of redesign.
So let's look at what this actually looks like in the real world. For decades, one country's mining sector was basically stuck in the past. But through a very deliberate top-to-bottom transformation, it managed to turn itself into a global powerhouse.
And the difference is just staggering. I mean, before the change, the ministry was basically just a rubber stamp for licenses for things like gravel and sand. It was literally sitting on a gold mine of geographic data that pointed to massive untapped resources, but there was zero incentive to do anything about it. After the transformation, the entire mindset shifted. They didn't just approve licenses anymore. They started actively marketing their country's mineral resources as a global opportunity.
This brought in huge international investment and led to a whole new ecosystem of agencies to support this much bigger vision.
70. For 70 years, that entire sector just sat there stagnant, simply because there was no incentive to change. Just let that sink in. That is the incredible hidden cost of doing nothing. And it's the perfect example of the immense power that gets unlocked by a true sector transformation.
So, let's tie this all together. What are the key takeaways here? First, real transformation redesigns the entire ecosystem, not just one organization. Second, it's usually triggered by necessity, when it becomes clear no single entity can get the job done alone. Success absolutely requires shared goals and aligned incentives. And when it works, the entire landscape shifts. New roles are created, old jobs change, and you attract a whole new class of investors.
Which brings us right back to our orchestra. Every industry, every public service, it's an ecosystem with lots of different players. So the question I want to leave you with is this. In your sector, who's conducting the orchestra? Or is everyone just playing their own tune?